I'm Tarek Masoud from Harvard University. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Middle East Support. All right, let's look at the first question. Here's a question from @PatrioticMommy1. Anyone know what Middle East countries are saying about the US bombing nuclear sites in Iran? A lot of Arabs, in particular, don't like the idea of the United States bombing a Muslim country in conjunction with Israel. That's a very powerful strain of public discourse in the Arab and indeed Muslim world. But on the flip side, a lot of Arab countries are afraid of Iran. They're particularly worried that the Iranians will use the strength that they derive from a nuclear weapon to assert their dominance over the region. And so they're not necessarily that opposed to the United States using its military power to thwart Iranian nuclear ambition. Here's a question from Quora. If you had to make a timeline of major events in the history of the modern Middle East until today, what events would you put on the timeline? The modern world begins in the 15th century, according to most historians. So you're asking me to pick 6 events over the last 500 years. That's really hard to do. The first is 1453, when Mehmet II conquers Constantinople, renaming it Istanbul. And that really is the beginning of the Ottomans' rise to power. They conquer the entirety of the Arab world, and it remains under their control for the next 500 years. The second point I would put there is in 1492, the Spanish Reconquista. The Spaniards force out the Arabs who had been controlling Spain since the 700s. Then I'd come to 1744, a local tribal leader in Central Arabia, Muhammad al-Saud, forges an alliance with a local religious leader named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And that gives rise to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, whose leaders are the descendants of al-Saud. The other thing it gives rise to is very puritanical understanding of Islam that we call Wahhabism, the radical ideology that eventually finds expression in organizations like Al-Qaeda. Then I'd come to 1798. Napoleon invades Egypt, one of the beginnings of Western colonialism in the Arab world. The next date I'd come to is 1897, and that is the date of the first Zionist Congress that decided that the way to cope with the scourge of anti-Semitism in Europe was for the Jewish people to have a homeland in Palestine, which in the Bible is the ancestral homeland of the Jews. That sets in motion the very tragic struggle that we're living through today between Palestinians and Israelis. Then we come to 1908, and that is when they discover in the Middle East the commodity that makes it so vital to the world, and that is black gold or oil. The Middle East is the world's largest producer. The last date, I'm going to say the end of World War I. It's really when the modern Middle Eastern state system comes into being. The British and the French and the Allies take over this part of the world, and they draw the borders that today are the source of so much conflict. Let's take another question. Dill Chips asks, it's been a bit more than 6 months since the Assad regime fell. Have things improved in Syria? It really depends on who you ask. This is the current president of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara. He was the leader of the militia that ultimately forced Assad out of Syria. And his militia is actually an offshoot of an organization known as Al-Qaeda, or as Americans call it, Al-Qaeda. It's a measure of how terrible things were in Syria under Assad, that this man, Shara, could be viewed by the majority of Syrians as a savior. Though Shara has made a lot of the right noises about wanting to establish a democracy, about not wanting to see conflict with Syria's neighbors, most notably Israel, he has been pretty brutal internally. So there was a crackdown against Alawis. It's a religious minority from which Bashar al-Assad came. Another religious minority that's located in the south, the Druze, are also coming under violence from militias associated with Shara's government. Are things in Syria better than they were when Bashar was around? If you ask this handsome gentleman, things are great. Let's take another question. At Fulham Frenchie asks, is Turkey part of the Middle East? The Middle East starts in the west in Morocco and ends at its easternmost extent either in Iran or, depending on who you ask, in Afghanistan. Some people say that actually the Middle East is just this part, and we should refer to this as North Africa. So some people will say the Middle East and North Africa. Regardless of which definition you want to use, Turkey is, of course, in the Middle East. But a little part of it, right here, is actually in Europe. Turkey has been torn between two camps. One camp that says Turkey is absolutely part of the Middle East. It is one of the biggest and most powerful and historically consequential Muslim majority countries. And another camp that says Turkey is European and it needs to become more like Europe. The founder of modern Turkey, a guy named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, said, look, in World War I, we were totally defeated by the Allies because the Turks were on the side of the Germans. The way we can never let that happen again is to become like the Europeans who defeated us. Ataturk instituted all kinds of reforms to make Turkey more European. One of the big things he did in Turkey, people used to wear a hat that looked like this. It's called a fez. The reason that lots of Turks wore it is because it's a hat that you could wear and still pray because it didn't have a brim and Muslims touch their foreheads to the ground when they pray. Ataturk was so keen on making his country European that he banned that headgear and said people needed to wear fedoras and hats with brims in order to become more like Europeans. That struggle between Ataturk's vision of Turkey and a more traditional Middle Eastern Muslim version of Turkey exists to this day. Big Ed Cactus Head asks, why has the U.S. Navy failed to stop the ragtag Houthis from attacking ships and protecting the shipping lanes? That's a good question, Big Egg Cactus Head. To answer it, it would be helpful to look at a topographical map of the Arabian Peninsula. So the Houthis are located here in Yemen. It's very mountainous terrain. It's sort of ideal terrain for a militia that wants to hide from its enemies. It's very difficult for the Saudis or the Emiratis or for the United States to actually hit the Houthis. The only way that you could actually guarantee that you would stop the Houthis would be a ground invasion, and this terrain is very difficult. Here's a question for Quora. Why hasn't democracy been working in the Middle East so far in so many countries? The only democracy that exists right now in the Middle East is the State of Israel. Lots of people argue that even the State of Israel isn't a perfect democracy because it occupies several million Palestinians who don't get a vote. And it's an important question as to why that is the case. Some people point out the United States hasn't necessarily been friendly to democracy in the Middle East. We've got all kinds of alliances with Arab leaders who are not democratic and who are not friendly to democracy. And that suits us just fine because we sometimes worry that if there was democracy in the region, it would bring to power a kinds of populists and nationalists who are not terribly friendly to the West. So another set of arguments says Islam itself is not necessarily friendly to democracy. After all, remember, the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was actually not just a religious leader, he was the ruler of the Muslims. And last time anybody checked, he didn't subject himself to a vote. And then the third set of answers has to do with the nature of Middle Eastern economies. Many of them are heavily dependent on oil. And when you've got oil, it means you basically pull your wealth out of the ground and sell it to foreigners. And what it means is you don't have to tax. Remember, no taxation without representation. So in the Middle East, you have the kind of the opposite. No demands for representation without taxation. This one is from Smexy Rexy Titan. Is what is happening in Gaza truly a genocide? Here's what is incontrovertible. There is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza of massive proportions. People argue about the exact number of people who have been killed. Is it 50,000? Is it more? Is it less? They argue about whether there's actually a famine going on in Gaza or just the beginnings of a famine. But the fact of the matter is that Gaza is today one of the most grim places on the planet, the death and destruction that have been meted out on that very small territory, on those very long-suffering people, is just extraordinary. And there is nobody with a heart who cannot feel extraordinary pain and grief upon looking at the pictures of what's coming out of Gaza. The question, though, of whether what is happening in Gaza is a genocide is actually a kind of technical question of international law. So there's a case right now before the International Court of Justice accusing the Netanyahu government of committing genocide against the Palestinians. And the International Court of Justice hasn't yet ruled on that, but they have determined that there is enough evidence to allow the case to go forward. In other words, they've concluded that there's merit to the claim. Some of the merit to the claim, they say, is found in the statements of Israeli leaders. You can look at the statements of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In one early speech, analogized Palestinians to Amalekites, which is a group in the Bible that fought the Jews and had to be defeated. There's Israeli security officials who have referred to the Palestinians as human animals. Even the president of Israel has said there's no such thing as an innocent Palestinian because they voted for Hamas 20 years ago. On the flip side, Israelis will point to almost every one of those statements and say they weren't meant to apply to Palestinians writ large. They were meant to apply to Hamas. They say Palestinians, we don't think Palestinians need to be eradicated. We think Hamas needs to be eradicated. On the one hand, this feels almost like a technical question. Let the courts decide what is genocide. But if you look at how this question has really torn apart so many Americans on college campuses, etc., it's because on both sides of this question are normal, good, well-meaning people who each have deep attachments to one side or another of this conflict. So this is probably the hardest question you could ask. Otters in Tuxedos asks, why is there so much oil in the Middle East? You really have to go back millions of years. What is now the Arabian Peninsula was actually a kind of warm and shallow sea that was full of plant life. That plant life ultimately gets sedimented layer upon layer, subject to tremendous heat and pressure, and turns into the hydrocarbons that you know and love. And what's particularly unique about the Middle East is not just that there's a lot of oil, but it is very easy to access. It's very close to the surface. It's not as simple as sticking a straw in the ground and sucking, but it's close. So it's very cheap to extract, and that's why the Middle East is really the gas station of the world. Here's a question from the No Stupid Questions subreddit, asked by Ulterior Kid 324. The United Arab Emirates has the lowest crime rate and the most influx of millionaires. What is their secret? The United Arab Emirates secret really comes down to what I call the 3 L's. Location, law, and lubrication. With location, this is where the UAE is located in the Arabian Peninsula. It really is at the crossroads of a lot of global trade. The leaders of the UAE recognized this in the 1970s and 80s, and they doubled down on turning their country into a global trade and logistics hub. They built one of the world's great airlines. If you want to fly from New York to anywhere in Asia or South Asia, odds are you're going to fly through Dubai. So the United Arab Emirates has some of the most business-friendly laws in the world, and they enforce them. If you go to the UAE now and you, for example, sign a contract with somebody in the Emirates, that contract is going to be enforced. Then we come to the third ingredient in the UAE success, and that's lubrication. And by this I mean oil. The UAE is oil rich, and they use that oil money to make their country into the kind of place that would attract millionaires and foreign investors and turn it into one of the most exciting parts of the Middle East. At Ryan57429 asks, what's the origin of the conflict between Israel and Palestine? So let's look at a map of this conflict. When we talk about Palestine, we're generally talking about this territory, the West Bank of the Jordan River, and this territory here, the Gaza Strip, on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. When people talk about the land from the river to the sea, this is what they're talking about. Jordan River, Mediterranean Sea. The basic reason for this conflict is that you have two peoples who are both indigenous to this land between the river and the sea and who cannot agree on whether to share the land or divide it, or how to share it, or how to divide it. One of the complications here is that for most of the last 2,000 years, there's only a very small Jewish presence there, the majority of Jews having been expelled about 2,000 years ago after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The Jews scatter throughout Europe, and we all know the history of the Jewish people in Europe, which is one of great tragedy and triumph. But ultimately, by the 19th century, the Jewish people have been experiencing so much anti-Semitism in Europe that a powerful movement emerges to resettle the land of Palestine. And so Jews start returning in large numbers in the latter half of the 19th century, and they invariably start to bump up against the Arabs who had been living there. In the very beginning, when Jewish immigrants from Europe show up, they have pretty good relations with the Arabs because the Arabs find in them source of employment. Arabs were agricultural workers, farmers, and so they would work on the lands purchased by the Jews. A little bit later on, some of the Jews who immigrate to Palestine have a different idea about how they want to live. They say, we don't want to depend on Arab labor. We want to become self-sufficient. And if you're an Arab faced with this new kind of Jewish pioneer, you're going to be upset because they're actually boycotting your labor. Another driver of the conflict between the Arabs and Jews is that a lot of the Arab land was actually owned by wealthy landowners who didn't live in Palestine. They lived in more cosmopolitan parts of the Ottoman Empire. And so when Jewish immigrants showed up and wanted to buy land, absentee Arab landowners were happy to sell it to them, selling the land out from under the native Palestinian Arab farmers who were working on it. So this was almost a perfect storm, guaranteed to create a very durable conflict. Mad Season 1994 asks, what is it about Dubai that so many dudes find appealing and always want to go there? One of the ways that Dubai has attracted so much global talent is by making the country really fun. So if you were to go to Dubai, you'd really find it to be the playground of the Middle East. Some of the world's greatest restaurants, hotels, and dance clubs and other entertainments. I, for example, went to SeaWorld in Abu Dhabi, and it was amazing. There's the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa. Really crazy building projects like this development that's made up of reclaimed land in the Persian Gulf. You know, you can't exactly reenact the plot of the Hangover movies there, but it is a very open society. But there is, of course, a less appealing side to it. If you are, for example, an Indian guest worker who's been brought in to Dubai or to any of the cities in the Arabian Gulf, from Doha to Riyadh, to build some of these gleaming skyscrapers, you're not having such a good time. You're making money to send back to your family, but you may be living in conditions that are not humane. It's not all fancy nightclubs and Michelin-starred meals for all of the young men who are in Dubai. This one is from the Israel-Palestine subreddit. How would a two-state solution even work? That's a great question. When we talk about a two-state solution, we're generally talking about a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. Right off the bat, there's two big problems that emerge. This Palestinian state would be non-contiguous. Got a part here and a part here, and they're separated by Israel. How do you deal with that? How do you actually have free passage of Palestinians from this part of their territory to this part of their territory without the Israelis feeling that having a bunch of Palestinians pass within Israel proper is a security threat? Another problem that jumps right off the bat, the Israelis say, if we also give away the West Bank and we have no security presence in the West Bank, then the entire state of Israel is vulnerable because there's lots of highlands here in the West Bank. Israelis say, well, we're going to cede the highlands so that the Palestinians can just launch rockets and artillery against us. But that's not even the half of it. Another problem is that This map is a little bit misleading because if we look at a detailed map of the West Bank, this is not one undifferentiated mass of Palestinians. The Israelis have, since 1967, been settling the Palestinian territory of the West Bank with Jewish settlers. And there are now about 750,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. How would it work? Would you have to expel the Jewish settlers? Can they remain in a Palestinian state and be safe? There's a lot of technical details that have to be worked out. And so when you ask how would a two-state solution even work, I'd say today in 2025, my answer is I don't know. I also don't know of any other solution to this problem. Here's a question from Nate Nando's 21. Why does the Middle East have so many wars? If you were to look at a map of the Middle East, you would see that the borders between Arab countries look like straight lines. You can almost see the British or French colonial officials standing there with a ruler and a pen drawing these borders. And that looks very different from the borders between European countries, which tend to follow natural formations like mountains or rivers. That leads to two kinds of conflict. The first is conflict between states, countries that don't necessarily like where the border was drawn when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. In part, that was because they didn't like where the British drew the border. And then it also leads to conflict within states. If you're a Kurd and you are included in this entity called Syria that the colonial powers drew, you may be thinking, this is not real. I'm not really a Syrian. We could have drawn this border in another way that would have given me an independent state of Kurdistan. At Tarian RD asks, what is the difference between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims? The main difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims really goes back to the early days of Islam. The religion, which today counts 1.8 billion people among its followers, was started in the early 7th century by a man named Muhammad, who is revered by Muslims as a prophet. When Muhammad died, the Muslim community was divided about who would lead them. Some people said, the Prophet Muhammad has this good buddy and father-in-law named Abu Bakr. He should be the one to lead the Muslim community. Whereas others said, the Prophet Muhammad's a cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib, is more suitable for leadership. There was civil war, and the Shias today are basically the descendants of those who supported Ali. They were called Shi'at Ali, the partisans of Ali. And today they make up about 10% of Muslims, concentrated in Iran and Iraq, with large populations in Lebanon, large population in South Asia. There's definitely conflict between Sunnis and Shias. For example, Iran and Iraq fought a war through the 1970s and early 80s. But of course, there's lots of Shias in Iraq who fought against Iran. So the idea that the conflict between Iran and other countries is about Iran being Shia and the other Arab countries being Sunni, that's a very contested idea. Here's a question from @Zenith6nil. Why is Islam always linked to terrorism? One of the arguments that you might hear from other scholars of the Middle East is that Muslims are often linked to terrorism because Western commentators have some prejudice against Islam. And that's why they're much more likely to call violence by Muslims terrorism and not apply the same name to violence committed by any other religious group. Others will point out that in the last 100 years or so, inhabitants of Muslim lands have had a lot of reason to mete out violence against Westerners. After all, the Middle East was subject after World War I to a series of occupations by Western countries. And there's still a very strong Western presence in the Middle East that a lot of Arabs chafe under. We saw this expressed most clearly on September 11th, 2001, when Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center. Their argument for why they did it was that this was in retaliation for oppression and violence against Muslims. But there's another group of scholars who say that the root of the Islamic connection with terrorism really goes back to the essence of the religion. And they'll point to chapters in the holy text of Islam, this beautiful book, the Quran, which exhort Muslims to engage in jihad or holy war on behalf of the Muslim community. And some people say that jihad really here needs to be understood metaphorically as a struggle against your inner demons. But others say that no, when the Quran talks about jihad, they are talking about fighting wars in order to spread the religion of Islam or to rid Islam of the domination or oppression of non-Muslims. Here's a question from the Ask Historians subreddit. Why did the US really invade Iraq in 2003? What's the real reasons behind the war? So remember, the Iraq War of 2003 was brought to us by this gentleman, George W. Bush, and it was to unseat Saddam Hussein, who was the dictator of Iraq. There were a couple of big reasons offered for why the United States needed to invade Iraq. The first was that Saddam Hussein was somehow implicated in 9/11. There was also an associated fear that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction, most critically nuclear weapons. One of the reasons people think that the war in Iraq was fought for other than its stated reasons. After the invasion, we found Iraq didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. So clearly there was something else going on here. Critics of the war, of course, make a third argument that it was all about that oil. And if you ask a second question, which is, did it pan out? You'd have to conclude that on almost every metric, the Iraq war was a failure. We didn't get any oil. We got rid of Saddam Hussein, who was an enemy of the Iranians, and basically empowered allies of the Iranian regime. And the collapse of Iraq gave rise to all kinds of terrorist groups that continue to wreak havoc in Iraq and in Syria in particular, even to this day. This one's from Lotus Wong TKO. I heard Iran was really very rich in the 1960s. Was it true? Iran was rich in the 1960s and it's still rich today. Remember, it's a major oil producer. One of the other things you'll hear about Iran in the 1960s was that it was very liberal. You'll see people share photos of women in Iran in the 1960s wearing mini skirts and having beautiful, finely coiffed hairstyles, and contrasting that to today, where women in Iran are kept under very tight restrictions with respect to how they can dress in public. And that really is a result of what happens in Iran, I would say starting in the 1950s. So in 1953, Iran is actually a constitutional monarchy. There's an Iranian leader named Mohammad Mossadegh who decides to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This is the major oil company that's producing Iranian oil, and it's owned by the British. America decides to cooperate with the British and overthrow him. And we do. But what happens as a result of that is that America invests very heavily in an authoritarian regime led by the king who called himself the Shah. And that was a very restrictive regime. They were pro-Western, they were modern, but they also did not brook any dissent. And it all explodes in the 1979 Iranian Revolution led by this man, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And this guy was a religious scholar who believed that the proper form of government is for religious scholars to rule. And he set himself up as Iran's supreme leader and inaugurates what is now known as the Islamic Republic of Iran, a country that is run on their understanding of Islamic law. This is from @Selenophile48. Why are there American bases in Qatar? Because look at where Qatar is. It is in such a strategically important territory. You've got Iran here. You've got the oil of the Persian Gulf that flows through here. So it's very important for the United States, which wants to ensure the free flow of oil and the security of its allies from Iranian adventurism, to have a military presence there to keep the oil flowing and to keep the peace. Socratic Tiger asks, why did America become pro-Israel in the 1960s? So if you were to ask a lot of Palestinians, they would find that to be a weird question. They would say, America has been pro-Israel from the very beginning. After all, the UN vote that results in the international global recognition of the State of Israel, the U.S. played an important role in lining up the votes for the State of Israel. The U.S. is one of the first countries to recognize the State of Israel. The question is right that something does change in the 1960s, where the alliance between the United States and Israel becomes much stronger. And I would say a big part of that is the Cold War. During the Cold War, where the U.S. is locked in this struggle with the Russians, we're looking for allies around the world. And in that point in time, the Arab countries didn't look like great allies. The oil-producing countries of the Persian Gulf were definitely pro-American, but then you had countries like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, where they were much more naturally aligned with the Soviet Union, both because they were kind of leftist in their orientation, but also because they saw the United States as the successor to the former imperial powers, whereas the Soviets talked about ending colonialism and liberating the peoples of the global South. Israel, in contrast, looks like a natural ally of the United States. Culturally, there are similarities because so many Jewish people came from the West. There's a large Jewish community in the United States. And the State of Israel at that time, unlike any of the Arab countries, was a liberal democracy. Here's a question from the Ask Middle East subreddit. What is Israel's main goal with invading other countries? Would the Middle East be more peaceful without them? The Israelis actually fight 4 wars against the Arabs. The first is the War of Independence in 1948, which the Palestinians call the Nakba, or the catastrophe. The end of that war results in the map of Israel looking like this. The Jewish state has captured all of the green territories, except for this, actually. This is the Golan Heights. And this territory here, the Gaza Strip, is controlled by Egypt. And this territory here, the west bank of the Jordan River, including Jerusalem, is captured by the Kingdom of Jordan. Then there was a war in 1956 in which Gamal Abdel Nasser, as he's called in America, he nationalized the Suez Canal. And so the British and the French, with the connivance of the Israelis, attack Egypt. They are eventually pushed out because the United States sides with the Egyptians. Then in 1967, Israel launches a preemptive war against its Arab neighbors. And that's because Nasser, that dictator in Egypt, was saber-rattling. His rhetoric was always very bellicose. He talked about throwing the Jews into the sea. So the Israelis would say, in 1967, the reason we, quote, invaded other countries is because we were facing a threat from those other countries. At the end of that war, they had captured not just the Gaza Strip, they captured the entire Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, they captured the West Bank from Jordan, and they captured the Golan Heights from Syria. It wasn't until 1973 when the Egyptians launched an attack on the Israelis in order to recapture the Sinai Peninsula that the Israelis lose Sinai ultimately as a result of a peace deal that they make with the Egyptians. 1982, the Israelis invade Lebanon because the Palestinian resistance movement had relocated to Lebanon and was launching cross-border raids against Israel. The general rationale that Israeli security analysts will give you is that all of these cross-border conflicts that Israel is involved in are in order to fend off attacks. That even includes the war in Gaza. Hamas uses their control of Gaza to launch rockets at Israel. And then when October 7th happened, that too is another reason why the Israelis say they have to wage this war. There's lots of people who point to the conflict between Arabs and Israel as the main source of conflict in the region. It's a major source of conflict, but it's not the only conflict in the Middle East. And you ask this question, would the Middle East be more peaceful without them? The natural answer is to say, well, why stop at the Israelis? You know, the Middle East could be a lot more peaceful. The world could be a lot more peaceful if there weren't any people. Where you have people, you have conflict. Here's a question from Playful Interview 753. Why the heck are the Saudis building a futuristic city in the middle of the desert? The question is referring to a city that the Saudis are building that is called Neom. This is supposed to be a futuristic city with beaches that have glow-in-the-dark sand, 100-mile-long linear skyscraper. One of the ambitions that the Saudis have is to really establish their country, just like their neighbors in the Emirates did, as an attractor for global talent. The Saudi Arabia that I grew up in was a very conservative society. So when I was growing up in Saudi Arabia in the 1980s, women weren't allowed to drive. Women had to wear concealing black garments when they went outside. And if you were unlucky enough to be caught outside during prayer time and you didn't go to the mosque, there would be religious police who would strongly suggest that you go and pray in the mosque. The current crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, is trying to change this. And so this project of building this big, glitzy city is an attempt to signal very powerfully that Saudi Arabia has changed and the new Saudi Arabia has arrived. Here's a question from the Afghanistan subreddit. Why does the Taliban want to stop women from doing anything? So the Taliban are the religious fanatics who currently run Afghanistan. They adhere to a particularly puritanical brand of Islam that believes that women's place is in the home and not experiencing equal status with men. This is a problem most acute in Afghanistan, but we see it to greater and lesser extent throughout the Middle East and indeed throughout the Muslim world. Lots of people will point out that in most commonly accepted understandings of Islamic law, women are accorded a subordinate status. They may not be as extreme as the Taliban, but for example, one aspect of Islamic law says that women should get less inheritance than men. The testimony of women in court is worth less than the testimony of a man. I personally don't feel that there's anything within Islam that is inimical to equality for women, but lots of conservative Muslims don't think that way. This is from the Explain Like I'm 5 subreddit. Explain Like I'm 5, the difference between kosher and halal. Kosher is the dietary regulation followed by adherent Jews, and halal is a set of dietary regulations followed by Muslims. There's lots of similarities between the two. Kosher, you don't eat anything that has to do with a pig. The same in halal. There's some areas where halal goes further than kosher. So for example, in Islam, it is not halal to consume alcohol, whereas it is kosher to consume alcohol for Jews. And there are other areas where kosher goes a lot further than halal. So for example, in kosher dietary laws, you're not allowed to mix meat and milk. In Islam, there's no such restriction. So a Muslim can have a cheeseburger, an adherent Jew cannot. In Judaism, for example, you're not allowed to eat shellfish. Most Muslims think eating shellfish is totally fine. One of the reasons they overlap is because Islam, like Christianity, descends from Judaism. There's all kinds of ways in which you can observe the practice of contemporary Muslims and see how it's so similar to the practice of contemporary Jews. For so many hundreds of years, Islam and Judaism developed together. When the Muslims dominated Spain, Jews and Arabs created their individual religious laws in conversation with each other. And that period of cooperation and that common genealogy is what makes the conflict between Muslims and Jews today so much more tragic, but it's also what gives me a little bit of hope that one day they'll be able to transcend it. I gotta say, those are some of the toughest questions I've ever faced. That's probably tougher than the toughest Harvard classroom. Thank you for watching Middle East Support.